The sky was still a murky indigo when the first warning blared through the National Zoo. It was the kind of early Washington, D.C. morning that made the city seem suspended in a dream. Silent streets, mist curling around the iron gates, a faint golden glow just teasing the horizon. But inside the zoo, something wild was stirring. No one saw the precise moment Ember, the bobcat, slipped through the breach in her enclosure. For hours, the cameras had flickered and failed in one corner of the big cat habitat, a fluke power surge tripping the ancient backup generators. Only the animals noticed, restless and uneasy long before the sirens screamed. Ember moved with the silent certainty of a ghost. Muscles coiled, fur blending into the pre-dawn shadows. She nosed at the weak point of the fence, heart pounding with a pulse older than captivity. Suddenly, with the deftness only the wild could teach, she was out. All at once, the world fractured. Red strobe lights flashed across the sky, painting the pathways with streaks of panic. Loudspeakers cracked alive. "Code Amber! Animal escape! Evacuate immediately! This is not a drill!" Radios crackled, and somewhere a keeper's mug shattered on the concrete. A woman screamed as she caught a glimpse of the streaking, muscular shape gliding along the visitor's path. Ember's tawny pelt was still marked with faint scars from her rough kittenhood, but she moved now with the confidence of something born free. In seconds, chaos was everywhere. A group of high school volunteers, early for a field trip, scattered, backpacks abandoned in their haste. Two security guards sprinted toward the central plaza, barely pausing to process the blur of movement that was Ember weaving between trash bins and benches. The air was thick with alarm, animal calls echoing off glass and stone, the anxious braying of zebras, the agitated cawing of a crow, the deep-chested warning growl of a distant lion who somehow knew a boundary had been crossed. But Ember didn't attack. She didn't leap at the shrieking visitors or swipe at the rushing staff. She moved like a question, not an answer, a mystery that left panic in her wake. Every muscle in her body was taut with intention, but her golden eyes were neither wild nor vicious. They burned with something stranger, a wary intelligence, almost haunted, that made the fleeing humans hesitate even as they ran. She reached a stand of shrubs near the flamingo pond and paused. Her breath came in quick, visible bursts. Her ears twitched at every noise. Somewhere, a child cried, but Ember's focus stayed locked on the open space ahead. She saw everything, the shattered routine, the shifting shadows, the desperate humans, and she remembered. It was in this moment, as she crouched beneath the shadow of a maple tree, that a small flock of sparrows darted overhead, scattering dew from the branches. Ember watched them rise and vanish into the sky, their freedom taunting her. For one heartbeat she thought of running, bolting for the iron gates, vanishing into Rock Creek Park, taking her chances in the city wild. The instinct roared in her blood, primal and intoxicating. But memory, that quiet ache, pulled her back. A sudden clatter echoed from behind. Two keepers, young and tense, stumbled into the clearing. One held a tranquilizer gun, the other a radio pressed so tightly to her ear she left white marks on her cheek. Ember tensed, body low, tail flicking. The keepers froze, staring. For an instant, the world held its breath, and then another alarm. This one deeper, more urgent. Overhead, a falcon shrieked and Ember flinched, her gaze flickering past the humans, past the open doors of the gift shop, and into the heart of the plaza. There, in the swirl of red lights and fleeing people, stood a figure the staff all knew. Walter Hayes, legendary even in retirement. Cane planted firm, silver hair glinting in the first touch of morning sun. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, he waited, calm and utterly still, at the plaza's center, like an anchor in the storm. Ember's attention locked on him, but she hesitated. The urge to flee warred with a pull she didn't understand, something buried deep, a scent, a memory, a familiar shape against the world's chaos. The keepers whispered frantically behind her, debating whether to fire, but Ember didn't care. All that mattered was the man in the plaza, his presence oddly gentle amid the roaring fear. Suddenly, a security vehicle skidded into the path, headlights slicing the gloom. Ember darted, a blur of muscle and grace, her paws barely touching the ground. She veered away from the men with the gun, leapt over a bench, and vanished into the deeper shadows, heading straight toward Walter, drawn by something older than danger, older than fear. As she moved, she brushed past a cluster of tourists huddled behind a kiosk, their eyes wide in terror and awe. One snapped a photo, flash bright and hot. The image would circle the globe by noon, a wild bobcat in flight, muscles gleaming, eyes burning with intent. "Bobcat on the loose at the National Zoo!" the headlines would blare. But none would know yet the reason for her strange, focused escape. In the plaza, the air felt charged, every human movement watched by the quiet intelligence of the animal world. Somewhere above, the sun finally breached the skyline, spilling gold across the chaos. And Ember, breathless and shaking, emerged from the shrubbery, stepping into the light. In that charged moment, alarms fading, staff poised, the world holding its breath, she locked eyes with Walter. For the briefest second, the years and fences between them fell away. No one moved. The wild was watching, and the story, impossible and true, was just beginning. The chaos in the plaza reached its peak, a frantic ballet of running feet, flashing lights, and voices shouting over the radio. Every second brought more people streaming in. Zoo staff in green polos, animal control officers with tranquilizer rifles, city police with drawn pistols, even a handful of early visitors clutching their phones, recording every trembling moment. Yet amid the confusion, a strange pause settled, heavy as a hush before a storm. At the center of it all, Walter Hayes stood unyielding. He was a figure apart, an island in the surging tide of panic. His cane planted beside him, his shoulders squared with a dignity earned over decades. He watched the unfolding drama with steady eyes. Silver hair framed a weathered face, lined but calm, exuding a quiet authority that made even the most anxious staff hesitate before acting. Some recognized him from old zoo newsletters and training videos, the legendary caretaker who'd retired just 2 years before, yet whose presence still lingered in every corner of the zoo. Walter didn't shout or gesture. He didn't flinch as the security alarms wailed or as a group of police rushed by, scanning the treetops and shadows for a sign of the bobcat. Instead, he waited. His gaze swept the plaza, catching details most missed. The trembling hands of a young keeper, the silent fear in a visitor's eyes, the nervous agitation of the peacocks behind the fence. Suddenly, the crowd's attention sharpened, a ripple of awareness, the way a flock senses a predator. Ember had emerged from the edge of the plaza, her presence magnetic, every muscle tense and quivering with possibility. The sun caught the reddish gold of her coat, illuminating old scars and the elegant power of her form. Her ears flattened at the shouts, her tail low, but her golden eyes burned with a strange focus. People recoiled, pressing against railings and walls. Someone dropped their coffee, another whispered prayers. Yet the Bobcat didn't attack, didn't even look at the nearest humans. Instead, she paused, head low, gaze fixed on Walter as if drawn by an invisible thread. For a moment, time stilled. Even the radios seemed to soften, voices turning distant. In that breathless gap, the plaza belonged not to the humans or the alarms, but to Ember and the man who met her stare without fear. Walter took a slow, measured breath. He didn't move closer. He simply stood, his posture open, his hands loose at his sides, inviting, but not commanding. "It's all right, Ember," he said, voice quiet but clear, every syllable weighted with memory. "No one's going to hurt you." A nervous staffer stepped forward, rifle trembling. "Mr. Hayes, please, let us handle this. That animal's dangerous. She could snap." Walter held up one hand, palm outward. The gesture was gentle, almost paternal, but its effect was instant. The staffer hesitated, caught between training and trust. The radio at her hip crackled. "All units, hold position. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage until further instruction." Somewhere, a supervisor had seen Walter on the security feed and ordered a halt, curiosity overwhelming protocol. The crowd began to murmur, torn between fascination and fear. Some took cautious steps back, while others craned for a better view, phone cameras trembling in their grip. The city police, guns raised, exchanged glances with the zoo staff, unsure who held authority now, the old man or their own rulebook. Ember's world was simpler. The surge of human fear rolled over her like a wave, but she didn't flinch. Her mind was a tangle of instincts and fragments of memory, the scent of panic, the shrillness of human voices, and the warm, familiar tone drifting to her through the chaos. Walter's scent was in the air, old soap, earth, a faint trace of something sweet. Beneath the adrenaline, her heart thudded with recognition. Though her wild side screamed caution, she edged forward a single step. The plaza seemed to shrink, all eyes drawn to the impossible scene. Wild predator, unarmed man, the world holding its breath between them. Walter kept talking, voice steady as a heartbeat. "Remember me, Ember. You know I won't let them hurt you. You're safe with me just like before." Behind him, a TV reporter was whispering urgently into her mic, her words barely audible above the din. "Unprecedented situation. Former caretaker, Walter Hayes, appears to be communicating with the escaped Bobcat." A tense silence fell again. One of the police officers hissed, "We can't just stand here. If she bolts, she'll get someone killed." Another, a younger man with a softer edge, shook his head. "Look at her. She's not attacking. She's listening." The scene held a surreal quality. Flickering lights, anxious faces, the click and flash of camera phones. Ember padded another step closer, her movements fluid but wary. Her golden eyes never left Walter. Somewhere deep in her animal mind, memories sparked and faded. A warm hand stroking her fur, a voice humming low in the night, the taste of fresh meat after a hard day. Confusion mingled with longing. Walter took a slow, careful step forward. His hands remained at his sides, empty, open. "That's it, girl," he murmured, as if they were alone in the world. "I know you're scared. But you remember, don't you? You know who I am." A gust of wind rattled the empty benches and sent a discarded map skittering across the plaza. Ember flinched at the noise, but her eyes never wavered. Around them, the crowd's tension shifted, from fear to awe, from panic to wonder. Something miraculous was unfolding, and even the most hardened staff could sense it. Walter smiled, the lines in his face softening. "You always did have good instincts," he said quietly. You always knew who to trust. For a heartbeat, time stretched impossibly thin, then snapped. Ember took one more step, close enough now that a breathless hush fell across the plaza. For just a moment, wildness and memory, fear and hope, collided in the space between Bobcat and man. And the world, watching, waited to see what would happen next. A stillness swept over the zoo's central plaza, unnatural, electrified, as if the world itself dared not breathe. The chaos and shouting faded into the background, replaced by a trembling anticipation. All eyes stayed glued to the improbable standoff, an elderly man standing alone, and a wild bobcat, powerful and unpredictable, but somehow transfixed, every fiber of her body alert but not aggressive. Walter Hayes, aware that even the slightest misstep could shatter this fragile peace, stood his ground. He had faced many wild animals in his career, wolves, bears, jaguars, but never had he felt the weight of so many unseen witnesses. It wasn't just the crowd that watched, but the city, the world, and most of all, Ember herself. He dropped gently to one knee, moving slowly, his cane clattering softly to the ground beside him. Walter's hands stayed visible, open and empty, a universal gesture of trust. He kept his voice low, soft as velvet. Easy now? That's right. It's me, girl. You remember? For Ember, the world was a storm of scents and sounds. The ozone tinge of fear, the sharp tang of sweat, the humming tension in the air. Her heart battered her chest, demanding flight, but something stronger rooted her in place. A memory she couldn't quite catch, a feeling she didn't have words for. She circled Walter, muscles tense, paws silent on the flagstones. Her tail twitched, a flicker of uncertainty, not threat. The crowd held its collective breath. Walter's mind raced through the years. He remembered when she'd first come to him, a half-starved kitten rescued from a forest fire, eyes huge and haunted. He remembered the bottle feedings at 2 a.m., her first clumsy attempts to pounce on a feathered toy, the way she would curl up at his feet, content and trusting in a world that had only shown her hardship. Raising Ember had been an act of faith, building trust one day at a time, never certain if the wildness in her would ever truly settle. He spoke again, his tone gentle and knowing, as if calling to her across the years. You used to do this. Circle me, just like now. Never sure at first, always thinking. You were the cleverest of the lot. His lips curled in a quiet smile, a bittersweet pride softening his weathered features. A few yards away, a young zoo intern named Marta crouched behind a bench, her phone forgotten in her hand. She watched in amazement as Ember paced a slow, spiraling orbit around Walter, always keeping just out of reach. The bobcat's ears flicked, her nostrils flared. She looked every bit a creature born to the wild, but the way she moved was different. Not like a predator stalking prey, but like an old friend wary of betrayal. Walter kept talking, more to Ember than to the audience. Remember the time you got your paw stuck in the door? You wouldn't let anyone near you, not even Dr. Chen. But you let me. His voice trailed off, thick with nostalgia. Ember paused, her golden eyes locked onto his face. Some flicker of understanding danced there, a flash of recognition so profound it left even the skeptics stunned. She huffed, a short, uncertain sound, and dropped her gaze to the ground, caught between instinct and longing. Behind the barricades, the zoo's director, Angela Stein, watched with her team. She gripped her radio so tightly her knuckles turned white. If he gets hurt, it's on us, she muttered. But something kept her from giving the order to intervene. Not yet. Not with this unfolding. The minutes stretched. The plaza's tension became a living thing, coiled tight. Camera phones captured every heartbeat. All it would take was one sudden movement, one panicked shout, for everything to end in disaster. Walter knew this. He didn't push, didn't reach out. He simply waited, trusting the bond he'd spent years building. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and fresh-cut grass, familiar smells from Ember's earliest days. She inhaled deeply, eyes half closing. With a sudden, almost shy movement, she stepped closer, the distance between her and Walter shrinking to a mere yard. Walter felt tears prick his eyes, but he held them back. He let his memories wash over him, how small she'd been, how fierce and stubborn, how impossible to contain or predict. "You always had your own mind," he murmured. "That's why I liked you." Ember's ears flicked. She took another hesitant step, close enough now that Walter could see the faint white scar along her left eyebrow, the result of a tumble she'd taken as a kitten. Close enough that he could smell the wild, earthy scent of her fur, layered with the subtle sweetness of spring. A child's voice whispered somewhere in the crowd, "She knows him, doesn't she?" The answer hung in the air, unsaid but understood. Walter lowered his head, a gesture of humility and trust. "If you want to go, I won't stop you," he promised, speaking only for her. "But I hope you remember you're safe." For a long moment, Ember was still. Then, with exquisite caution, she sat. Not in defeat, not in surrender, but in wary acceptance, like a queen granting an audience on her own terms. Walter let out a slow breath, relief and awe warring in his chest. A shudder ran through the crowd. Some people wept, overcome by the raw emotion in the air. Others began to whisper, stories forming already. The miracle of a wild animal's memory, the power of a gentle voice. A raven perched atop a lamppost cawed, breaking the silence. Ember looked up, then back at Walter. The world seemed to expand again, noise and chaos flooding in, but different now, charged with hope. Walter slowly picked up his cane, never turning his back, never breaking eye contact. He got to his feet, stiff but steady. The connection was unbroken. Man and beast, past and present, joined by trust that defied logic. In that moment, a new chapter began. Not just for Ember and Walter, but for everyone who witnessed it. The story was no longer about an escaped bobcat. It was about what it means to be remembered, and to remember in return. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the plaza in a golden light that softened the harsh lines of fear etched into every face. The crowd remained silent, captivated by the strange peace that had descended. For a few miraculous minutes, even the screech of distant sirens and the clatter of boots on concrete faded into the background. All that mattered was the silent understanding between man and bobcat. But beneath that calm surface, a current of memory was stirring, powerful, unpredictable, and more real to Walter than the present moment. As he stood before Ember, he found himself drifting back in time, memories surfacing so vividly they felt like dreams come to life. He remembered the first time he saw her. It was late autumn, the leaves a riot of red and orange outside the rescue clinic. She was so small then, a frail, trembling scrap of fur barely larger than his hand. The ranger who brought her in whispered about the forest fire that had orphaned her, how she'd survived by hiding under a fallen log, too young to understand loss, but old enough to feel its ache. Walter had never planned to take another animal home. His wife had passed just the year before, and the silence of his house pressed in on him every night. But when he looked into Ember's eyes, huge, wild, and full of terrified hope, he couldn't refuse. He wrapped her in an old wool scarf, feeling her heartbeat flutter against his chest, and carried her through the cold to his car. Those first days were a whirlwind of sleepless nights. Walter made a nest of towels in a laundry basket by his bed, waking every 3 hours to warm formula and trembling paws. Ember's cries were small, almost bird-like at first, and she would sometimes fall asleep, with her face buried in the crook of his elbow. At dawn, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, she'd purr, a sound so faint it could break your heart. It was as if she was reminding him they were both still alive. Walter smiled at the memory, standing in the present but lost in the past. He remembered how Ember grew stronger, bolder. She learned to chase his shoelaces, to stalk the sunlight across the living room rug, to pounce with an ungainly enthusiasm that made him laugh for the first time in months. The bond between them was built on tiny acts of faith, a gentle hand, a whispered word, a moment's trust earned and never forgotten. But it wasn't always easy. There were nights when Ember's wildness took over, when she would hiss and lash out at shadows, her instincts at war with the safety he tried to offer. Walter never raised his voice. He simply sat nearby, reading aloud or humming softly until she calmed. Over time, Ember learned he meant her no harm. She let him clean her wounds, teach her to play, and, eventually, teach her to hunt for herself. He remembered the day he knew she was ready to return to the wild. Ember was nearly full-grown, her coat sleek and her eyes clear. Walter took her to a protected reserve, tears in his eyes as she bounded out of her carrier and vanished into the underbrush. She paused once, looking back at him through the golden light, and in that moment, he felt something shift. It was the hardest act of love, to let go of what you most want to keep. Back in the present, standing in the plaza, Walter realized with a start that his hands were trembling. He gripped his cane tighter, grounding himself. Ember, still sitting before him, watched with a curious intensity. Did she remember those early mornings, those hard nights, the warmth of a shared home? Or was it all just a blur of sensation, woven into her animal soul? In Ember's mind, too, the world swirled with half-remembered images. The sharp, clean scent of soap. The soft sound of humming, rising and falling like wind through grass. The feel of strong hands, never rough, always patient, lifting her up after a tumble, smoothing the sting from her wounds. She remembered chasing crumpled paper balls under chairs, the thrill of pouncing on shadows, the steady comfort of a gentle voice in the darkness. Now, surrounded by fear and noise, Ember felt the echo of those memories pulling her toward Walter. She remembered the taste of freedom and the ache of loneliness. She remembered running, always running, but never from him. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to dissolve. There was no plaza, no crowd, no howling sirens, just the two of them, linked by a bond that defied the limits of memory and reason. A trust born of need and nurtured by time, now called back to life in the most impossible of moments. Walter knelt again, fighting the stiffness in his knees. "I know you remember, don't you, girl?" he murmured. "It's all right. I'm still here." A single tear slipped down his cheek, unnoticed by all but Ember. The bobcat blinked slowly, a gesture as ancient as her species, and for the briefest moment, her wary posture softened. She inched forward, the wildness in her eyes tempered by something gentler, a recognition that went deeper than words. A hush fell over the crowd, as if everyone sensed the miracle unfolding. Even the most skeptical security guards found themselves holding back, transfixed by the sight. Walter smiled, old griefs and old joys mingling in his expression. "You're still my Ember," he whispered, "no matter how wild the world gets." In that moment, memory was not just a ghost. It was a bridge between past and present, wild and tame, loss and hope. And across that bridge, a wounded bobcat and a lonely man found each other once again. The fragile peace of the plaza lasted only a moment longer, suspended between the memory of trust and the rising tide of panic. As Ember inched closer to Walter, the world seemed to awaken all at once. A surge of footsteps echoed along the walkways, security reinforcements arriving in a rush, radios blaring urgent orders, animal control forming a perimeter around the open square. From every side, armed officers pressed in, their faces set with a grim determination that brooked no argument. At their flanks, zoo staff clustered in nervous knots, whispering fiercely, eyes darting between Ember, Walter, and the guns now drawn and ready. The crowd behind the barricades thickened. Some visitors streamed live on social media, voices quaking with disbelief and fear, broadcasting the drama to thousands who watched in real time. The hashtag #BobcatMiracle began to trend before the hour was out. Angela Stein, the zoo's director, strode into the plaza, flanked by her deputy and a local police captain. She took in the scene, a retired caretaker kneeling before an apex predator, the animal's tail twitching with uncertainty. A battery of weapons pointed at both man and beast. She pressed her radio to her lips. "Everyone hold," she commanded. "No one fires unless I give the order." Her voice trembled at the edges but held fast. Walter felt the shift immediately. The air thickened with tension, the hair rising on the back of his neck. He stood slowly, pain flickering across his face as his knees protested. Raising his hands, he turned not just to Ember, but to the entire assembly of anxious staff and heavily armed strangers. "This animal is not a threat," Walter declared, voice steady, carrying to every corner of the plaza. "Lower your weapons. You're only making things worse." One of the police officers, a young man with nervous eyes, kept his rifle aimed at Ember, fingers white-knuckled on the trigger. "With all due respect, sir, we can't take that risk. She's a wild animal. She could attack at any second." Walter stepped forward, refusing to flinch. "She's not just any animal. Her name is Ember. I raised her from a kitten. She remembers me. She remembers kindness. If you push her, if you frighten her now, you'll force her to do what nature taught her: defend herself." A murmur swept through the staff. Some knew Walter by reputation, recalling his gentle manner with the animals and the deep respect he'd earned over a lifetime. Others only saw a stubborn old man risking everything for a wild creature. The debate crackled in the air. Science versus protocol, compassion versus caution. Angela hesitated, eyes flicking between Walter and Ember. She could feel the eyes of the world watching, the weight of every decision pressing down. Behind her, the police captain leaned in. "We can't wait much longer. If that animal attacks, there'll be hell to pay." But another voice rose above the crowd. A woman named Dr. Chen, one of the zoo's senior veterinarians. She stepped forward, clipboard forgotten, hands open in a gesture mirroring Walter's. "Director Stein, please. I've worked with Mr. Hayes for years. If he says Ember is safe, I believe him. Let's trust his judgment. Just this once." A heated debate broke out among the staff. Some echoed Dr. Chen's plea, voices tight with hope and fear. Others shook their heads, clinging to regulations and the cold comfort of protocols. One security guard muttered, If something happens, it'll be on all of us. Ember, caught in the crossfire of human emotions, lowered her head, her ears flicking with agitation. She could sense the fear and anger, smelled it on the wind, tasted it in the air. Yet the gentle cadence of Walter's voice still held her in place. He turned back to her, risking his own safety for a chance at peace. "It's all right, Ember. I'm here. You remember, don't you? You remember who you are, who I am." Walter took a step closer, putting himself between Ember and the drawn weapons. The crowd gasped, the tension mounting to a fever pitch. Ember did not bolt, did not bare her teeth. Instead, she watched Walter with an intensity that bordered on reverence, a wild heart recognizing the only safe harbor it had ever known. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the barricades. A teenage boy, his voice breaking with fear and excitement. "She's not hurting anyone. Just let them be." Others began to murmur in agreement, the wave of empathy rippling outward. A woman live streaming to her followers choked back tears. "This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. She knows him." Angela, her authority challenged by both protocol and public sentiment, made her decision. She stepped forward, lifting her hand to the armed officers. "Stand down. Lower your weapons. No one is to fire unless I say so." One by one, the muzzles of rifles and tranquilizer guns tilted down. The plaza exhaled, a single immense breath held too long. Walter nodded his thanks, relief etched in every line of his face. He knelt again, beckoning Ember closer, his voice gentle. "Come on, girl, you're safe. No one's going to hurt you now." A news drone buzzed overhead, capturing the moment from above. The old man and the Bobcat, the guns lowered, the crowd riveted by hope and disbelief. For a heartbeat, compassion won out over fear, and science made room for something older, wilder, and perhaps more true. And as the plaza settled into a new, uncertain calm, the world beyond its gates was already beginning to take notice. Silence reigned across the plaza, a fragile, miraculous hush in which every footstep, every breath seemed to thunder in the air. Weapons lowered, fear held in check by something softer, more ancient. Even the wind seemed to pause, dust swirling lazily through shafts of sunlight, as if nature itself waited to see what would happen next. Walter Hayes knelt, not caring that his old knees burned with the effort. He ignored the ache in his back, the weight of so many eyes, and instead focused all his attention on Ember. He looked at her not as a wild threat, not as a problem to be solved, but as someone he had known and loved. He reached out, not with his hand, not yet, but with his voice, gentle and unwavering. "Ember," he whispered, "it's me. Remember how I used to greet you every morning? You'd wait by the door, tail flicking, pretending you weren't excited. You were always too proud to show it, always so stubborn." His words were soft, but carried across the hush, weaving through the crowd and settling over Ember like a memory returned. She stood just a few feet away, muscles coiled, ears alert to every noise. Her golden eyes flicked from Walter to the crowd and back again. She felt the uncertainty, the lingering fear, but most of all, she felt the gentle cadence of his voice, a song she'd known in another life. She took one hesitant step closer, then another, paused silent on the cool plaza stone. Walter's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe slow and steady. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, a leather cord with an old silver button, tarnished and worn. It was a piece from his wife's coat, the only toy Ember had ever kept. He dangled it at his side, the sun catching on its edge. "You remember this, don't you? You always chased it, even when you grew too big for games." A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. News cameras zoomed in, 1,000 strangers holding their breath as wild animal and old man met in the middle ground between memory and instinct. Dr. Chen whispered, almost prayer-like, "Come on, Ember. Remember who you are?" Ember's nostrils flared. She recognized the scent, faded but real. In her mind, a flood of impressions. The warmth of a fireplace, the thrill of leaping for the silver button, the joy of a life where hunger and fear were distant things. She inched closer, head lowered, eyes never leaving Walter's face. The tension peaked. A security officer shifted nervously, the strap of his tranquilizer gun creaking. One sharp noise, one startled movement, and it could all unravel. Walter spoke again, his voice trembling just enough to betray the depth of his emotion. "You trusted me once, Ember. I need you to trust me now." Time slowed to a crawl. Ember stood mere inches from Walter. The world receded. The crowds, the guns, the swirling doubts. There was only the sunlit space between them, charged with the possibility of grace or disaster. Walter slowly extended his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed, the same gesture he'd made when she was just a frightened kitten. For a long moment, Ember did not move. Her tail flicked, ears twitching, her wild side warring with the ghost of safety and love. And then, with emotion so tentative it broke the hearts of all who watched, Ember stepped forward and pressed her head against Walter's hand. The crowd gasped. Some people sobbed openly. Others stared in stunned silence as Walter, tears streaming down his cheeks, let his hand rest on the Bobcat's head. His thumb traced gently behind her ears, just as he'd done years before. Ember stood perfectly still, a low rumble vibrating in her chest, a purr unmistakable and ancient, an echo of the bond they had once shared. Angela Stein dropped her radio, hand covering her mouth as emotion overtook her. Dr. Chen let out a joyous, shaky laugh. "I told you," she whispered to no one in particular. "They remember." Walter spoke softly, words only for Ember. "It's all right, girl. You're safe. No one's going to take you from me, not now." The world seemed to melt away, replaced by the quiet miracle in the plaza. For a few sacred minutes, wild and human, memory and present, predator and caretaker, became one. Cameras flashed, but the story now belonged to them, a reminder that love, once truly given, was never lost. A child pressed to the front of the crowd, whispering, "Look, Mommy, she's hugging him." The moment rippled through the onlookers, hope and awe swelling in their chests. Finally, Ember stepped back, her posture calm, eyes clear. She looked at the crowd, at the open gates beyond, then returned her gaze to Walter, as if awaiting his next move. Walter rose, every joint aching, but his spirit alight. He spoke to the officials, to the crowd, to everyone watching. "She's not dangerous. She's scared and lost, like any of us would be in her place. Please, give her space, give her a chance. Trust what you've just seen." Angela nodded, voice choked with emotion. "We will. Let's clear the plaza. Give them room." Her command was obeyed, not out of duty, but out of respect for the bond they had all witnessed. As the crowd dispersed, a new sense of wonder filled the air. Strangers hugged, children pointed at Ember in amazement, and for a brief, golden time, even the hardest hearts softened. In that hush after the storm, Walter knelt beside Ember and whispered, "Thank you, my girl. You saved me too. You always did." And in the heart of the zoo, under a sky washed clean by hope, man and bobcat sat together, free if only for a moment, from the fear that ruled the world. It didn't take long for the scene at the National Zoo to escape the confines of the plaza and explode onto screens across the globe. News helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thumping like the heartbeat of a city awakened. Every major network cut to live coverage, aerial shots of the crowd, zoomed-in footage of the elderly man and the wild bobcat, and the faces, awed, tearful, stunned, of the people who'd witnessed a miracle. The hashtag #Bobcat Miracle trended worldwide within minutes. Social media flooded with shaky cell phone videos, breathless voiceovers, and amateur theories. Clips of Ember brushing her head against Walter's hand, her fur glinting golden in the sunlight, her body language unmistakably gentle, replayed in endless loops on every feed. People shared the footage with captions like, "The power of memory," "The wild never forgets," and "Proof animals feel." In a New York newsroom, anchors paused their stories about traffic and politics to cover the unfolding drama. In classrooms across the country, teachers pulled up the live stream, urging students to watch history in the making. Even in hospital waiting rooms and airport lounges, strangers gathered around televisions and phones, united by a sense of wonder. Walter, meanwhile, had no idea how far his quiet courage had rippled. He stayed at Ember's side, a gentle hand on her back, offering soft words that only she seemed to hear. The plaza emptied, but he was dimly aware of a new energy, a spreading hope, a lifting of something heavy in the air. Zoo staff escorted visitors out, many of them glancing back with wet eyes or shy waves. Some lingered at the gates, talking in hushed, reverent tones. "I'll never forget this," one woman said, wiping her cheeks. "I've never seen anything like it in my life." Within the hour, news vans clogged the streets outside the zoo. Reporters jostled for position, lights glaring, microphones raised as experts began to arrive. Animal behaviorists, psychologists, and zoologists, everyone with a theory about what had just happened, and none of them fully sure what to call it. On a local channel, Dr. Chen appeared, her face flushed with excitement. "We've always known that some animals remember individual people," she explained, her voice trembling with conviction. "But what we saw today was deeper. It wasn't just memory. It was trust, maybe even love. Science is just catching up to what we all feel in our hearts." National talk shows booked Walter for interviews, but he declined them all, at least for now. When a CNN producer called, he answered quietly, "I just did what anyone would do if they really loved an animal. This was about Ember, not me." Still, the world couldn't get enough. The bobcat who remembered became a phrase repeated everywhere. From news tickers to late-night monologues, artists drew digital sketches of Ember and Walter. Children wrote letters and drew pictures, mailing them to the zoo. "Thank you for saving Ember," read one crayon-scrawled note, taped lovingly to the entrance gate. Not all the attention was positive. A wave of critics, some zoo professionals, some internet cynics, questioned the safety and wisdom of what had unfolded. "They were lucky it worked out," one cable news guest argued. "A wild animal is still a wild animal." But their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming chorus of awe and gratitude. Animal rights organizations seized the moment. "This shows why enrichment and lifelong relationships matter," declared a spokesperson from the Animal Welfare Society. Donations poured in to support wildlife rehabilitation centers and programs that paired orphaned animals with long-term caretakers. In classrooms, the lesson of the day became more than biology. It was about empathy, about trust, about the unexpected bridges between species. One teacher, her eyes shining, asked her class, "What can we learn from Ember and Walter?" A dozen hands shot up. Love doesn't disappear. Animals are smarter than we think. Sometimes being kind is braver than being strong. The National Zoo's website crashed under the weight of millions of visitors. Their social channels overflowed with messages. Some were simple. "Thank you for showing us hope." Others shared personal stories. A man from Iowa posted a video about his childhood dog who had found him after 10 years apart. A woman in Tokyo shared her bond with a rescue cat who never forgot her voice. Each story added to the growing chorus. We are all part of something bigger than ourselves. Walter's neighbors in his quiet DC suburb baked casseroles and left them on his porch. Reporters left polite notes in his mailbox, hopeful for a word. But Walter remained at the zoo, sleeping in a spare office, visiting Ember during quiet hours as officials and veterinarians carefully monitored her health. One evening, the zoo arranged a small press conference on the main lawn. Cameras clustered around Walter, Dr. Chen, and Angela Stein. Someone asked Walter, "How did you know Ember would remember you?" He smiled, lines crinkling at his eyes. "I didn't know for sure," he replied. "But I hoped. That's what bonds are. They're leaps of faith. Sometimes, the wildest part of life is what stays in your heart, even after you let it go." Dr. Chen nodded. "This is a lesson for science, too. There's still so much we don't understand about animal memory or about trust. Maybe today, we all got a little closer to the truth." Around the world, people listened, watched, and wondered about the nature of memory, about the power of kindness, about the possibility that the wild inside us is, in the end, just another kind of love longing to be remembered. And as night fell over the city, families shared the story over dinner tables, and children went to sleep dreaming of wildcats and old friends. The world felt, if only for a night, a little less divided, a little more whole. In the days that followed Ember's escape and reunion with Walter, the atmosphere at the National Zoo transformed from electric anxiety to thoughtful reflection. The plaza that had once buzzed with panic was now filled with curious visitors, news crews setting up daily, and a subtle sense that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just a wild animals story anymore. It was a question mark over the very heart of how humans understood the creatures in their care. Angela Stein, the zoo's director, felt the full weight of this transformation as she convened an emergency meeting in the boardroom. Seated around the long table were veterinarians, animal behaviorists, senior keepers, public relations staff, and a handful of board members, all eager, exhausted, and uncharacteristically humble. At one end, Walter sat quietly, a reluctant celebrity, his hands folded and his gaze steady. Angela opened the meeting with a sigh. "We all saw what happened," she began, her voice softer than usual. "The whole world saw. We can't just go back to business as usual. Not after this." Dr. Chen, still glowing with pride, spoke up. "We witnessed something science can't fully explain. Ember recognized Walter, even after all this time. That's not just memory, it's relationship, and it should change how we care for these animals." A senior keeper nodded, flipping through a folder. "We always assumed our animals adapted to new faces. Maybe we underestimated the depth of their bonds with the people who raised them." The debate grew lively, opinions flowing from every corner of the table. Some worried about safety, about precedent. What happens if every old caretaker wants to walk into an enclosure? A risk officer challenged. But Dr. Chen countered. It's not about recklessness. It's about respect. Walter and Ember show us the value of continuity, of honoring the relationships animals form with their people. Walter finally spoke, his voice gentle but sure. I don't expect special treatment. I only want what's best for Ember, and for all the animals like her. If my being here helped her feel safe, maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us. Angela nodded, determination growing. Let's take a hard look at our policies. Maybe it's time we allowed supervised visits from former caretakers, especially in difficult transitions. And not just for the animals' sake, but for the people too. Maybe there's a healing here, for both sides. A hush fell. For a long moment, the boardroom was filled with a sense of possibility that felt almost revolutionary. The following week, the zoo announced sweeping new initiatives. A pilot program would be launched, pairing retired caretakers and trusted former staff with animals in their care, allowing scheduled, supervised reunions, especially during periods of stress, illness, or major change. The zoo also invited top universities to partner in new studies on animal memory and emotional bonds, promising full transparency and open data sharing. The news rippled outward, echoing through the world of animal care. Zoos in other cities reached out, requesting guidance, eager to launch their own pilot programs. Animal welfare groups applauded the shift, arguing that honoring animal bonds was a necessary step forward for modern ethics. For Walter, these changes felt bittersweet, a validation of everything he had poured into his work, but also a reminder of what had been missing for so long. Each time he visited Ember now, he did so openly, greeted by friendly staff and the watchful eyes of researchers who took careful notes but never interfered. Ember herself seemed calmer, her wild edge still present but softened, her movements fluid and sure. One afternoon, Walter found himself standing beside a group of young keepers, watching as Ember explored her expanded, enriched enclosure. Logs, climbing platforms, and fresh scents gave her new challenges, designed by staff eager to engage her mind as much as her muscles. Walter smiled, pride and hope mixing in his chest. He turned to the group and spoke, not as an expert, but as someone who had learned, sometimes the hard way, what it meant to love the wild without trying to tame it. It's not about possession, he told them. It's about trust, about letting go when it's time, but never forgetting the bond you've made. These animals teach us as much as we teach them, if we're willing to listen. The zoo's new approach quickly drew national attention. A documentary film crew arrived to chronicle Ember's journey, interviewing staff and visitors, capturing the cautious optimism that now permeated the grounds. Walter appeared in a few scenes, always redirecting praise toward the animals and the keepers who worked tirelessly to honor their well-being. Meanwhile, the board established an Animal Enrichment and Memory Fund, supported by donations from the public and matching gifts from local businesses. Its purpose was simple: fund research, support enrichment programs, and ensure that no animal was ever treated as just another exhibit. Every animal, the new signage read, has a story worth remembering. In staff break rooms and late-night phone calls, keepers swapped stories of their own favorite animals. How a gorilla once remembered an old song, or a rescued owl always responded to the voice of her first caretaker. The culture at the zoo changed quietly but decisively, respect blossoming where there had once been only routine. For Walter, life slowed back to something like normal, though strangers still stopped him on the street to say thank you. Sometimes, late at night, he sat at his kitchen table sipping tea and wrote in his journal about the wildness that lingered inside both him and Ember. He knew now that the past was never truly lost, not when it was built on love and respect. The wild and the human, he wrote, could meet halfway. It only took a little courage and a willingness to listen to the echoes of memory. It was late and the city was settling into that quiet hush that only comes after a storm of excitement. For the first time in weeks, Walter returned to his own home, letting the familiar sounds of old floorboards and the ticking of a wall clock anchor him in the present. The world outside seemed softer now. News vans gone, neighbors waving politely instead of peering in curiosity. The wild, dizzying spotlight finally swinging away from his door. Walter moved slowly through his house, passing the photographs and souvenirs that marked a lifetime of caretaking. Snapshots of lions and lemurs, faded newspaper clippings, the collar of a dog long past, and now, right at the center of his mantle, a photo that someone had printed from the news. Ember pressing her head into his palm in the plaza sunlight, both of their eyes closed, lost in a world only they could share. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his journal, a thick, battered book he'd started years ago when he first retired. He had not written in weeks. The last entry ended abruptly, a scrawl about loneliness and old aches that felt impossibly distant now. Tonight, he turned to a new page and began to write, the words flowing slow and careful, each sentence carrying more weight than usual. "What does it mean to be remembered?" he wrote. "What does it mean when the wild looks back at you and says, in its own way, 'I know you. I trust you. I haven't forgotten'?" He paused, looking out at the darkness beyond his kitchen window. Somewhere, an owl called, low, haunting, ancient. Walter's heart echoed with something just as old. "Science will chase answers for years," he continued. "They'll measure synapses and hormones, dissect the patterns in Ember's brain, searching for the why. But I think the real lesson is simpler and harder. Not everything worth knowing can be proven. Some things are felt, lived, and only recognized by the heart." Walter remembered his wife's favorite saying, "To love is to risk never truly understanding, but to do it anyway." He smiled, the memory as sharp and sweet as a spring morning. Ember had taught him the same lesson in a language beyond words. Her loyalty, her wildness, her return when he'd almost stopped believing in miracles. He wrote about the nights he'd sat up feeding Ember, about the first time she'd let him stroke her head, about the gut-wrenching ache when he let her go. He remembered the fear he felt in the plaza, not for his own safety, but for hers, for the possibility that fear would win over faith. Yet in the end, it was the memory of kindness that bridged the gap. Walter paused to reflect on what had changed at the zoo, but his thoughts reached deeper. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the wild didn't exist only in animals like Ember. The wild lived in people too, in the stubborn hope that keeps someone loving despite loss, in the part of the soul that refuses to be fully tamed by disappointment or age. He wrote, "Some bonds cross species, time, and understanding. They're not about possession. They're about respect, about seeing the wild in another and not trying to cage it, but learning to live alongside it, honoring it, letting it be what it is. That's the hardest lesson I've learned, and the most rewarding." He recounted moments from recent days, staff approaching him with their own stories of animal loyalty, strangers stopping him on the street, a child handing him a drawing of a bobcat, and an old man holding hands. But most of all, he reflected on the humility required to admit how little humans truly knew about the minds and hearts of other creatures. "Science is about not knowing everything," he wrote, "and being humble enough to keep learning." Maybe the greatest mystery isn't out there in the wild, but right here, in the space between us and the animals we love, in the memories that refuse to fade, in the trust that endures after everything else falls away. Walter thought about his last visit with Ember. She was different now, more relaxed, but still regal, still wild. Their visits were closely watched by researchers, but to Walter, each moment was a gift. He found himself whispering thanks, not just for her safety, but for the way she'd reminded him that love was never wasted, that every act of care lived on somewhere in the world. He wrote, "True connection isn't measured by time, but by the courage to show up again and again, even when it seems hopeless. The wild can teach us about loyalty, respect, and the humility of not knowing everything. The wild reminds us we're all more alike than we think, creatures made for freedom, for memory, and for bonds that can't be broken by years or distance." The kitchen clock chimed midnight. Walter closed his journal and sat quietly, feeling the peace that comes when a hard lesson finally settles in the heart. He thought about Ember, sleeping in her new, enriched habitat under the watchful gaze of staff who finally understood her story. He thought about the other animals, about the people whose lives were changed, about the mystery that would never be solved but could always be cherished. Looking out at the night, Walter felt gratitude well up in him, deeper than sorrow, deeper than pride. He whispered to the darkness, to Ember, to anyone who might be listening, "Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for letting me remember you." And in the silent, wild space between memory and hope, the greatest mysteries of the heart lived on, waiting always to be rediscovered where the wild and the human meet. The story of Ember and Walter lingered in the city's air like the sweet afterglow of a summer storm. In the weeks after their miraculous reunion, the National Zoo found itself changed, not just in policy, but in spirit. Visitors now paused longer at the Bobcat enclosure, reading Ember's story displayed on a polished plaque, peering through the glass, not with idle curiosity, but with a new reverence. The staff walked the grounds with fresh purpose. Even the most jaded keepers smiled a little more, their steps lighter. They had all witnessed something rare, a reminder that beneath routines and regulations, their work was, at its core, an act of faith and connection. But perhaps the greatest change rippled far beyond the zoo's gates. It was a golden Saturday morning when Walter was invited to speak at the zoo's community amphitheater, a broad, sun-drenched space ringed with benches and the rustle of nearby trees. Families crowded in, some with children clutching homemade drawings of Ember, others with elderly parents who remembered Walter from decades past. Staff, volunteers, and even Angela Stein and Dr. Chen found seats among them, determined to hear the story again, this time in the words of the man who'd lived it. Walter stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. He glanced at the faces before him, some hopeful, some curious, some quietly moved. Nearby, Ember lounged in her enclosure, visible through the glass wall, her presence almost regal. Cameras from local news stations and streaming smartphones formed a gentle semicircle, but Walter hardly noticed them. He was thinking of the long nights and the quiet mornings, of the lessons that had taken him a lifetime to learn. He cleared his throat, the hush falling deep. "Thank you for being here," he began, voice steady, if a bit rough. "If you had told me years ago that I'd be standing here talking about a bobcat, I'd have laughed. I never set out to find a wild companion, but sometimes the wild finds you, and it leaves its mark in ways you can't forget." A ripple of soft laughter drifted through the crowd. Walter continued, his gaze turning inward. When Ember was a kitten, she needed me for everything. She was scared, and I was lonely. We healed together, each in our own way. But I learned, very quickly, that to truly care for the wild is not to possess it. It's to respect it, to give it what it needs, even if what it needs most is freedom. He told the story of Ember's first days in his care, her fear, her fierce independence, the trust that grew drop by drop. He spoke of the heartbreak and pride he felt when he let her go, hoping she would survive, not knowing if she would ever remember him. He paused, the memory filling his eyes with light. I thought I'd lost her to the wild forever, but the wild doesn't always mean gone. Sometimes it means changed. It means waiting, trusting, believing that the kindness you gave will return to you someday in a form you can't predict. The audience listened, transfixed. Even the smallest children sat silent, sensing the weight of the moment. Walter's voice grew softer. What happened in the plaza wasn't a miracle just because Ember remembered me. It was a miracle because she trusted again. She chose connection over fear. And in that moment, every barrier, species, time, distance, fell away. We were just two souls who'd once shared a little kindness, finding each other again. He looked around, his gaze inviting everyone into the story. I believe there's a bit of wildness in all of us, something longing to be seen, to be trusted. And maybe there's a part of us that's afraid too, afraid of letting go, of being forgotten, of loving and not being loved back. Walter let the silence settle, letting his words find their way into hearts. But if you've ever cared for an animal, if you've ever felt a connection you couldn't explain, a memory that lingered long after the moment passed, I want you to know you're not alone. These bonds are real. They matter. They shape the world in ways science may never fully measure. He smiled, a warm, humble curve. If you have your own story, I hope you'll share it. Tell your children, tell your friends, or tell us here. Let's fill the world with stories that remind us how much we all need kindness and how far it can travel, sometimes across years, sometimes across species. The amphitheater burst into applause, some people rising to their feet. Children waved their drawings, and families hugged each other, voices rising in hope and gratitude. Angela Stein stepped forward, offering Walter a commemorative plaque. For reminding us of the wildness and the kindness inside us all, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Chen, wiping her eyes, added, "We're better keepers for animals and each other because of what we've seen." After the event, visitors left their own messages on a board near Ember's enclosure. Some shared photos of pets who'd changed their lives. Others wrote poems or simple thank you notes. One little girl drew herself holding hands with a bobcat, a heart connecting them. Walter lingered long after the crowd had gone, standing quietly by Ember's enclosure. The bobcat padded over, eyes bright, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. No barriers, no fear. Only the recognition of a bond that had survived the wildest of journeys. As the sun slipped low, Walter walked home past families and strangers who smiled in greeting. He felt at peace, knowing the story he and Ember shared would ripple outward, inspiring others to notice, cherish, and respect the wild wonder in their own lives. For those who listened, the lesson was simple. Love, given freely, is never truly forgotten. It shapes the world, one gentle choice at a time. And if you have ever shared a bond with an animal, wild or tame, lost or found, share your story. Let it be a reminder for all of us that the wildness and kindness inside us are never far apart.